institutionalization of politics, and also an opportunity to relocate emotions, particularly joy, as a vital realm for the production of meanings in people's lives. And with this, I don't want to sort of elevate football to art, but to try to explain why it is art. And I don't want to elevate art to politics either. I think Benjamin said, I don't remember exactly the quote, but that the artist becomes a politician when his art is exhausted, right? When politics become a declining detour for artistic expression. And there may be something about Maradona in his late stages of his life. But like many other artists in the past, whoever, Beethoven or Leonardo, I think that if Maradona is relevant today, and I think it's going to be relevant in the future, is because regardless of everything else, he remained for a very long time devoted to his specific art. And when I say that people mourn the death of a great artist in Maradona, I mean that he excelled in what is probably the most widespread form of popular culture worldwide in three simultaneous levels. First, I think that he solved every single challenge that football presented to him, all of them. Working in great teams or in mediocre ones, being old or being young, perfectly fit, injured, rested, restless, under pressure, without pressure, inside the field, outside the field. And what held this capacity together was the production of what an apparently infinite physical, mental, and emotional resources connected all into a single entity that was himself. And second, the most important part, I think that he solved all those challenges by always pushing the limits of the genre, by doubling down in an exploration of what was possible. And yes, he did so by creatively sort of adapting to circumstances, running more or running less, depending on the circumstances, directing an orchestra or sort of playing solo, speeding up or slowing down. But also, I think he did so by sort of joyfully exploring what else he could do with his body, what else he would discover to amuse himself and to amuse others. We all remember the goal against Italy in Mexico in 1986, where he scored this incredible speed from an improbable angle, shooting with the external side of his left foot across his body to the farther side of the goalie, where you can literally see in that image, discover new muscles in his legs, muscles that you didn't even know that existed, that, as you can see in the picture that is also, that I'm using as a background. There seems to be nothing he could not do at that moment. And now we can think, for example, how artists like Cervantes confronted literature as an exhausting endeavor, yet one full of joy and full of fun, exploring infinite ways of mastering a story, a sort of a very hard-working task in which life is literally consumed, right? I think that George Steiner had compared Maradona with Shakespeare. Mariano Siski, a friend and an art professor who teaches about culture and football at Harvard, thinks about this Kantian experience of the sublime, in which the world is so almost suspended, in this case by a human creation. How did Maradona achieve that? The idea that there is an Argentine style or a potrero spirit, right, that Maradona was able to bring to the big leagues, the skills learned in Buenos Aires shanty towns, is interesting, but I think that is misleading. Seeing his evolution over time, it becomes obvious that he's been practicing these ideas and moves since the late 70s. He might have been always a genius, of course, but he was not always shining in exactly the same way. First, there's this Maradona of the early years in which he's pure fun, playing mostly with himself, with a sense of his skills much more developed than his own body, and more developed that a sense of the entire field. And then there's this Maradona of the early 80s that sort of connects this sense of pleasure with a more thoughtful pondering about his mental and physical skills. You can see that more things in Mexico 86 had been tried before. practiced and revised during that period in Argentino Juniors against Boca, in a memorable run in Barcelona, or during a game against England 6 years before the famous one that we all remember. But I think it is only in the third phase, when he moves to Italy, when Maradona becomes sort of a full body. To get this genie out of the bottle, Maradona engages with the most competitive league, from the disadvantaged starting point of Napoli, develops his body, improves his training, and practices his sense to get an idea of the entire team, his own team and the adversary, to become sort of a real master on a much bigger show that is necessarily and almost always a collective. The Maradona of Mexico 86 is more generous, more calculating, and more fit than his previous versions. And probably nature and the memory of his early days in the shantytown are important, but I think they're far from enough. He benefited from all the resources of professionalization, but I think that it was in order to bring to the center the spirit of the amateur, in the deepest sense of the term. Amateur not as imperfect or unprofessional or lazy, but someone whose inner engine is love for what he does. The amateur, el que ama, the one who loves, is in Maradona also a product of an exhausting training in which his life and his body are ultimately used up. So he solved all the challenges. He did so by pushing the limits of football. And third, he was the greatest storyteller. He relocated all these actions as part of a sort of a teleological story, connecting his biography with a collective feeling of a struggle from below. Victories and failures were sort of reinterpreted along two contradictory tenets: a revenge of the dispossessed against the powerful, and a sort of a perpetual threat of a backlash of the powerful against the powerless, always looming in the horizon. I think there's no predestination or no social origins in Villa Fiorito that explain this, that explain why Maradona builds this narrative. Class imaginary, we all know, is not the product of material conditions, but the result of sort of a discursive effort to make sense of those conditions. And Maradona could have been, for example, the star of Barcelona, had not been for an hepatitis and a player from Atletico de Madrid, Goicoechea, who broke his ankle. But once he felt that his days in Barcelona were over, he found a solution to the problem that soccer presented by going to an improbable place like Napoli. He pushed the limits of what was thought it was possible in a team like that. And then he reinscribed those actions as part of a centuries-old confrontation between the impoverished South and the racist and wealthy North of Italy. I want to bring this story, finish it by bringing him back home. In the 1970s, Borges famously said that Argentina would be a different country had the national book been Facundo instead of Martin Fierro. Had the country embraced an indictment against the sort of dreadful effects of plebeian emotions instead of celebrating those emotions. And I think that during the last decades and during the last weeks after Maradona passed away, there has been a similar complaining going on, that Argentina would be a different and a better country had the symbol of its most vibrant cultural form were Messi instead of Maradona, right? If talent and genius could be provided, but deprived of excesses. And I think that the analogy is relevant because as literature 100 years ago, football, the game and everything else surrounding football, is a realm in which people actually define who they are, and where we create stories about why we're part of a community, who is the us in the nation, how we look like, where we are in the social order. Any social order is about the control of emotions. Any dream of a modern rationalization of human relations is about subduing feelings to the point that make them intelligible and predictable, right? The dream of having a contained genius, a talent who behaves, who stays put, is the dream of reason. And Maradona, with his bundle of contradictions, was the ultimate expression of modern football's culture and industry. But as such, and I finish with this, he was also a talent that was impossible to tame by others and by himself. And the myth, the global icon and the myth, so powerful that it has brought people to tears for decades, grew out of those excesses. Not so much the excesses so obviously condemned, but the extremes of love to his creation, in which millions have found a joy, comfort, and also a sense of a collective victory.
Thanks, Ernesto, for your presentation. The next speaker is Professor Ma. Sorry. Thanks, Ernesto, for your presentation. The next speaker is Matthew Brown.
Thanks very much, Patricia. Thanks to University College London for inviting me. Thanks, Ernesto, for that great paper. I didn't cry, but nearly. So yeah, great to have a token Englishman on the panel to be humiliated by the skills and genius of everybody else, but I'll try and do my best. And it's wonderful to see everybody, so many friends and my intellectual inspirations in the audience there. So hi everyone in these terrible times. It's lovely that we've got this moment to be together. In 2014, I published this one, General History of Latin America, called From Frontiers to Football. And I picked out Diego Maradona as one of the Latin Americans whose international projection was such that outsiders, like my students, should know about and reflect upon their cultural significance, alongside the big names such as Che Guevara, Simón Bolívar, José Martí, Evita, Pinochet, Rigoberto Menchú, Lula, Evo Morales, and inevitably also Pelé. Reaction to the news of his death around the world demonstrated how everyone seemed to have a stake in Diego. His skill on the field, as Ernesto was describing, was often so sublime and his story so potent that his life carried some meaning for everyone, both those weeping beside his coffin and those writing, "But he was a cheat," in capital letters in the comments section underneath the articles that I wrote. I'm really looking forward to the question and answer session as part of this panel. There are so many people in this room with observations to make and insights to add. I saw Diego Maradona play football just once in a friendly for Argentina in Chile's national stadium in 1994, in which the play and in fact the world seemed to revolve around him while he was on the pitch. I'm going to make 3 brief points. First, I'll set the scene talking about how that World Cup quarter-final affected me in 1986. Then I'll talk about the stereotypes of Latin America in England and how Diego Maradona fitted into these through the 1980s and 1990s. And finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts about public commemorations of Latin Americans in the United Kingdom. So, on Sunday, the 22nd of June, 1986, I came home from Boy Scout camp. I was 11 years old, and if fan is the right word at the time, I was a fan of non-league Wycombe Wanderers. That day at Scout camp, according to my diary, here it is, I picked it out of the roof, we played tug of war, and we played a game called Throwing the Shuttlecock, which makes it feel a bit like 1886 instead of 1986. Then I came home and watched the England-Argentina match on television with my mum, dad, and brother. The headline in my diary for the 22nd of June, 1986, I think you can see it here, "England are out," it says. I then went on to write, Maradona's first goal was a great volleyball shot but the second was Brill, see diagram. I provided, as you can see, maybe you can't quite see, a diagram of the way in which the little X, which was Maradona, moved around the little dots, which were the English players. Barnes helped Lineker scored our goal, which proves my point that Barnes should have played earlier. Overall, Argentina cheated. Clearly, in 1986, the combination of the two goals touched a nerve, not just amongst 11-year-old boys, but across English football society, which was already scarred by the 1985 tragedies at Bradford and Heysel. It showed the importance of football to English national identity in the post-imperial age. I suggest that most English people would rather have won that World Cup quarter-final than the Falklands War, which, as Sue Townsend portrayed it in The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, published just at the same time, was often hidden under biscuit crumbs when they tried to locate it on the map. Let's move on and talk a little bit about stereotypes of Latin Americans in the UK. These have waned over the last 34 years since 1986 as a result of the continued decline of the remnants of the informal empire, the great efforts of the Latin Americanists in the UK, many of whom are now in the room, and maybe more importantly, the incorporation of hundreds of thousands of Latin American migrants into British communities, families, and narratives. Latin Americans have become normalized in schools and workplaces in the UK, from offices to football pitches. So in a way, the myth of Diego Armando Maradona, the flawed Latin genius, was still passable in the British media in the days after he died, because it was a throwback to the comfortable old stereotype of the 1970s and 1980s of, you know, uncontrollable emotion, sublime skill, womanizing, illegal narcotics, criminality, and the preference for trickery over fair play. Brenda's going to take care of the gender politics of all of this in a moment. As Kate Fox's amazing book, Watching the English, showed, the English sense that their national character is distinguished by a sense of fair play, supporting the underdog, and knowing your place in social hierarchies is largely an invented one, but it's no less real for that. And it's a combination of factors. It's a result of a combination of factors, some of them imperial. The thing about Diego Maradona, of course, was that he didn't know his place. That was the whole point. And that's why he remained an icon to people across the world who saw him bursting through the defenses of the old order. I think Britain's imperial presence in Latin American history is not without relevance here. In my 11-year-old's diary in 1986, I admired Maradona's skill and remarked on his cheating, no doubt influenced by the BBC commentary that evening. The reason why so many have been unable to let it lie for 34 years is that Diego Maradona successfully took on England at its own game, association football, which was itself a form of the informal empire. The international competitions in association football since the 1900 Olympics and the first FIFA World Cups from 1930 that England deigned not to attend were shaped by England's claim to preeminence based on having invented the exercise of kicking a ball into a target by means of the codification of the rules in 1863 that were then globalized in the late 19th century. As I show in my forthcoming book that Patricio mentioned, Our Common Goal, the origins of football in South America lay as much with local people as with Germans as with Britons, and in multi-sports clubs as much as with football associations. The invention of the British fathers of football, such as Alexander Watson Hutton and the alumni team in Buenos Aires, was as much a creation of the first footballers themselves as it was a faithful representation of historical reality. As everybody apart from the fringe English nationalists have recognised by now, though, and as Diego Maradona remarked himself, that photograph of Peter Shilton with his eyes closed, punching the air, is actually quite funny. And for a nation that is supposed to pride itself on its sense of humour, it's probably time to join the celebration. Which leads me to my final point around commemoration. An event like this is really interesting. It's going to be a stimulating discussion and lots of fun. What better way of demonstrating that great English sense of humour and finally accepting the referee's verdict from 34 years ago as final than by putting up a statue in England to the player recognised as the greatest of all time by people as diverse as Gary Lineker, Eric Cantona, Leo Messi, Ryan Giggs and Wayne Rooney. Let's think first about which Latin American men are currently commemorated in the UK by a statue. Brackets, there are no women at all. We can talk about that later. I don't really hold a candle for statues generally, and my own city, Bristol, is currently much more famous for putting them down rather than putting them up. However, statues of Latin Americans in the UK fall into three categories. First, it's the heroes of national liberation from the independence period. Simón Bolívar in Belgrave Square in London, just over the road from José de San Martín, also in Belgrave Square, Francisco de Miranda in Fitzroy Square in London, and Bernardo O'Higgins in Richmond. Second, there are the statues to the sportsmen, Ayrton Senna and Juan Manuel Fangio at the Donington Park race circuit, and Cyril Regis at the Hawthorns, who was born in French Guiana in South America, so it's tenuous, but he played for my team, Wycombe Wanderers too, so he's on the list. Apparently there's a statue of Sergio Aguero planned for the City of Manchester Stadium, but that's it, sportsmen. And then the third category of statues of Latin Americans in the United Kingdom is the religious figures. There's the Easter Island Moai at the British Museum, although we're hoping that they might be going back soon, and Saint Oscar Romero, the martyred El Salvadorian priest who has a statue at Westminster Abbey. So, congratulations to everyone who's seen this punchline coming. National liberation heroes, sportsmen, and religious figures. Diego Maradona was all of these, with the 1986 World Cup against England, in David Goldblatt's words, a performance of canonical status. It's clear that he fits the bill. So, to conclude, where should the statue of Diego Maradona go? Outside Wembley Stadium, outside the National Football Museum in Manchester, outside Peter Shilton's house, perhaps. And if not in England, then maybe there's a claim for putting it at Hampden Park, home of the Scottish national football team and the Scottish National Football Museum, and where Diego scored his first international goal in 1979. But certainly it should be up on a pedestal, as some people would probably want to tear it down. Thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to discussing later on.
Thanks, Matthew, for your presentation. Now we have the presentation of Brenda Elsey.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thank you for the invitation from UCL. And I'm so honored to be asked to do this. And like the others said, to see the people in the audience, there are quite a few of you that know a whole lot about the history of Latin America sport and also Maradona. I'm just going to talk really informally and quickly because I am really enthusiastic about the conversation we're going to have. First, a little bit about gender, then about Maradona as an anti-imperialist figure, and a little bit about the global transfer market, which is probably not super exciting to everyone, but I think actually has a lot to do with the politics of Maradona. So, right, being the feminist historian is often a sad position on these panels because, of course, Maradona is someone that I'm intrigued, enamored in lots of ways by. But a lot of the quotes that we've seen over the last couple of weeks have built on the writer Fontana Rosa, who said, I don't care what Maradona did with his life. I care what he did with mine. And that's really moving. It is. It was for me too. But I also thought to myself, what message does that send? And who gets that pass in history? Who is it that we can say? And of course, it goes back to the question of separating the art and the artist. And I think it's perfect that Ernesto started with that point. So Maradona really aesthetically had a lot of anti-authoritarian aspects to the iconography about him, right? At a moment when the dictatorship was dictating short hair for men and long skirts for women, there's Maradona with his unruly hair and earrings and tattoos and his whole physical embodiment and performance of rebellion. And that's really important, I think, to a lot of people and their memory of that time. At the same time, we know that he was frequently guilty of making homophobic comments, of using homophobia as a way to diminish other men. We know from the videos from a few years ago about his record of hurting women close to him and far away. And it's hard, you know, that's a very painful thing to grapple with, but it's also intellectually really important, because we have to understand sort of what the significance of reproducing that is. When the Argentine women's football team went on strike in 2017, they asked Maradona for his support, which he did not give. So there's actual, it's not just symbolically, but his political legacy is contradictory, and it's not easy to sort of, for a lot of people to move on. But I think what's most important has been the reaction to the Argentine feminists that have made this point, and the sort of violence and the vitriol that he has channeled, not Maradona himself, of course, but as soon as they brought this up, the reaction to how dare you, how could you ever do that? And that needs a lot of analysis, to my mind, you know, where that's coming from and what it says in this moment where Ni Una Menos has really changed a lot of the social movements throughout Latin America. When the women's team at Gimnasia last year raised these questions when Maradona was appointed as manager, they were absolutely isolated and alienated. And so the question of why you cannot integrate these things, and when Ernesto's talking about joy, that's really useful to think through, right? What does it mean to kind of integrate a painful legacy within that? Why is the framework, you know, what does it say about sexism and gender that the framework is as such? So in any case, I think it leads to one of the reasons, which is because Maradona really was symbolically important to the left in Latin America and beyond. And so it's sullying more than just a football icon, but also a political icon for a lot of people. And I think one of the interesting things is that Maradona maintained and articulated his working class background as a political identity in a moment when footballers were being told by agents, were being told by sponsors, you have to depoliticize. If you want a Nike contract, if you want this, you cannot go out there and say, oh, I love Chavez. That is not going to get you a Nike sponsorship. So he really was very different than what the industry of football was recommending at the time, even in the 80s. I mean, there's a lot of examples of this, and we can talk about Pelé as a different sort of related example, but an interesting one. And I think it's a really important question then to think about his status as a political symbol of the left and a little bit of the distance between that and the reality of actual political work, just as scholars, which I think we rarely look at, right? So he's a celebrity. He's one of the only and first and most important celebrities of football in terms of having a working class politics. The distance between that and his actual work is pretty fascinating. In the 1990s, he tries to start this radical labor union with Eric Cantona, and says FIFPro, the International Players Union, is not radical enough. And it's kind of his gesture to start to really do some political work and build a constructive project. And it doesn't get off the ground, not so much maybe for his fault, as so much as the power of that. So it's kind of interesting to think about him in global terms, in terms of labor. And I don't think there's enough about that, because you see, for example, Ernesto said it was improbable he went to Napoli, but actually that was the second time. It was the second time that he broke the global transfer fee. And that transfer fee, millions of dollars, he didn't get any of. It's between club and club, right? And he never forgot that. He never sort of got over the fact that he had broken this record and yet saw none of the money. And he knew that you know, Division 2, Division 3 in Argentina. So there was a solidarity that he had. And I think it's really interesting to think about how he tried to transfer at certain times that working class identity into an actual project. Though, you know, it's important to think today you have someone like Marcus Rashford, right, in England doing this massive campaign. You know, his symbolism seems to have always outshone a bit of the actual work, and that doesn't need to be forefront in our minds or discussions. I just think it has to be something that we think through as we see the commemorations of him as being this political icon. I think icon is the right word, more than perhaps worker, and what that means, you know, to us, that he did more work as a symbol than in actual movements, yet we see people doing that. And just finally, I would say, so that I'm not, you know, only a feminist killjoy presentation, but to also say, but I will continue to be that throughout the Q&A. I don't really take that hat off very easily, but I will say the story of him, that narrative in Argentine football history was already built, and he stepped right into it. Right? Valdano says at a certain point, I left Argentina and played in the Bundesliga in Germany because there's a call to a style of play that I was never gonna fit. And he says he said in lots of ways, lots of different interviews, he says, I was never going to be able to play like Maradona. And if I'm being very honest, I would rather see Maradona play than Valdano. So I think he has a beautiful intersection with a history of working class Argentina, and he's able to kind of just step into this role that the fans and the football culture in the clubs had built for the working class player already. And the fact that the most excellent athlete, that the most excellent artist was a working class person remained very important. During the dictatorship, during neoliberalism, in the post-dictatorship period. So I'll end on that more positive and loving note.
Thanks, Brenda, for your amazing presentation. Well, we're opening the Q&A section, so please, if you want to add a question for the members of the panel, just write it in the chat box. I will start reading some of the questions that people had left here. Just a second. Okay. David Weber asked, hi everyone, a question for Ernesto. Wasn't part of Maradona appeals his politics? Asked the Neapolitans, he wasn't a politician in the conventional sense of the term, but he was in many aspects a freedom fighter. I figure he had, for an oppressed, dispossessed class. That is surely political. It's a question for Ernesto.
Yes, but I guess I'm gonna comment on that, but I guess it can be also the beginning of a more open conversation if everybody else or anybody else have something to add. And my answer will be yes and no. Yes, politics understood as the specific statements about the relation between the state and society, and political decision-making process, were things about which Maradona had strong opinions, as about pretty much anything else, and that sort of surrounded his public persona, and became part of the communication, right? Part of the fabric that connected him with this larger body of followers, fans, society, those who hate him, etc., etc. I do think that the most relevant political component of him, a little bit in relation to what Matthew said in relation to its impact in England, and Brenda in relation to how he recreated permanently his working class origins. I think that the political core of Diego Maradona as a symbol has more to do with the way he reinterpreted constantly soccer, football, what he did as a player, what happens in football as a cultural realm. I think that most of what started to create this idea, I don't know if it was your question or the idea of a freedom fighter, which I don't know if it's exactly the right expression, because he always connected his fights to some sort of a collective endeavor, have more to do with the way he told the story of football than about specific political statements that in some ways built the outer side of what he was as a symbol. And in relation to that, and one of the reasons why it was that, is what Brenda mentioned by passing, which is the specific timing in which his stardom, he rise to fame in Argentina first and worldwide later. The 80s, and we're not discovering anything here, but the 80s, far from being a lost decade, are probably the last moment before neoliberalism, and it's a terrible word, but I say a strong, violent, and systematic effort for an hyper-rationalization of every single social relation, is the last moment in which we live before that. The changes happening in the 80s and consolidated in the 90s are probably going to be as relevant as the card changes 400 years ago. I can't even imagine how to frame that to give a sense of how important they are. There is in that, and that affects particularly soccer, which lives in that moment that goes is going to become sort of a global phenomenon in a much stronger way than what it was before, partly due to technology. It is in that moment in which the industry and the culture of football creates this icon that at the same time becomes impossible to control. Maradona, I was thinking about that before the talk. Maradona becomes famous worldwide in 1979 when Argentina wins the final against the Soviet Union. His last efforts internationally are in 1994, when that country no longer existed, and he's playing in the most improbable places of all for football World Cup, which is the United States. He had gone on the side of a huge transformation of which I think the peak is Italy 1990. Do we think that when we say that his politics matter, are we referring to the way he behaved in the final when he was like muttering "hijos de puta" in front of the camera in Italia 1990, or we're talking about whether he was shaking hands with this or that other political leader? Because the way he described his performance in Italy and the way he performed in Italy during the 1990s, I think that are deeply political. And are deeply political not because of the way he plays soccer, but the way he reinscribed those games within a specific narrative. At the moment in which Italy, which is probably hard to remember now, was focusing on the World Cup as one specific moment for sort of a cleaning its image in the process of becoming part of the European Union. Pretty much exactly the same what was going to happen with Spain in 1992 and 1994 with the Olympics and the World Fair. He's going through in a process, on the side of a process of reconfiguration of society in which things like football are particularly crucial to redefine the meaning of this new society. So in that sense, I do think politics matter and are extremely crucial to understand why he became an icon. This other part, this more specifically directly political engagements, I think they are part of him. I have the sense that they are more on the side. I have the sense that most people, when think, cry, or feel about Maradona, have those things more on the outer side of what's going on, and have more in the center the emotions with the relation of their personal biographies with his sport achievements and the way he narrated those achievements. Right.
Thanks, Ernesto, for answering. A question to all of Juan Said Bawa. Is there a contradiction in Maradona being a working class icon and his accessible luxury lifestyle as a millionaire footballer? Did this not contradict his political stance and every cause he has supported? What do you think about luxury politics in Maradona?
I can start. What I would say is capitalism is a total system. Right? So focusing on, I think there's a lot of focus on consumerism and athletes and working class athletes in particular, if they're Black athletes, become a heightened spectacle and scrutiny over their personal consumerism. I don't find that really contradictory at all, except insofar that that's the economic system in which we live that would force that. At the same time, Maradona is pretty well known for not being particularly generous. I'm going to just hide here as a charity wise, or building that. So there are, and I'm not saying he should be, right? I'm not out here with a moralistic agenda of what he should do with his salary, but he is not the most generous economically in terms of charity things. At the same time, when he was, for example, when he's in Cuba, he famously lives in this like really lavish house. He's not living as a Cuban. So there's a contradiction a bit between, Fidel Castro's my father, and I 100% agree with him and everything he thinks and his actual lifestyle. But again, I think, that's a question to give a lot of pause to in terms of how we look at historical actors.
Matthew and Lester want to add something about this?
I'll have an opinion on that as a working class historian when I become a millionaire.
Good one.
That's a good point. But there's a lot of questions about the Maradona's link with Cuban Revolution. But I think Brenda had addressed a little about it. But I don't know if someone want to add something. Okay. To Brenda, there are a lot of questions about the gender politics of Maradona, as someone could expect. One of the questions addresses that recently Flor de la Vega, that is a famous trans actress and activist, wrote an article about this event when Maradona said her, like he was, congratulations for her achievement of receiving her DNA ID card. There had been a constant contradiction between public Maradona and intimate Maradona. Which one we should take in consideration to analyze the relationship with LGBTQ community and gender politics in general?
I mean, I don't think that's an either or. It's a and situation. A lot of the I camped out with the Argentine women's team before the Copa America, and I can tell you that they have their dream is to have, Maradona's jersey. So when Ernesto talks about the power of the artistry, there's no doubt that for women footballers, everything that Maradona achieved, and we focus a lot on 86, but we could talk a lot about 1990. We could talk a lot. We could talk a lot about his time at Barcelona, even if it was brief and ended in a kind of, one of the greatest football brawls of all time, probably. But in any case, he can still be a kind of inspiration. So I don't think it's sort of an either or question. His personal life, in terms of that, because of the way that he lived, is there really a thing as him having a personal life? To a certain extent, he becomes public, and all those actions that he does become public artifacts, even if he wouldn't wish them to be. So whether it's you interview or you do that, you're nice to this person on the street. I'm not sure that division we can take it, nor do we need to say he's one thing. This was also never a person who came out and said, I am the model for a moral life. Maradona doesn't set himself up to be a role model of moral. Mm-hmm. He knows life's not fair. That's one of the reasons people love him. And he wants to exploit that, and that's okay, I think.
I also think of following up exactly on Brenda's point, that two things about this. One is that we need to take it to sort of sort out what we are asking about or wondering about his biography and the things he did and he did not do, and the other is to try to elucidate if those things are relevant or not for the people who consider him an icon. Are those things at the center or not? It's common for those who love Maradona to say that people basically condone his private behavior. I don't even know if that's true. I don't know if everybody cares in the same way. I don't know if it is at the center of what people think. He scored twice against England. I don't care if he beat his wife. I don't see that happening. I don't think the process in which you relate to an object of love, much more one that is not directly related to you, is so direct and explicit. And as Mariano Siski, who is around here in the screen, I don't know where, said in an interview recently, you don't love the right person or the wrong person. This is not even a question. You just love, and you usually love people for wrong reasons also, and So I don't think that the dimension of gender, which I think is important in the analysis of those who want to analyze his actions, I don't think that is at the center in the same way that is being posed in many of the debates of whether people accepted or basically blame him for the things. And in that sense, analytically, about football or any other thing, I think it's always important, I don't remember whose phrase was that, to differentiate the question from your question. And I know that that is our question, and it might be the question of many, but I don't know if that's the question upon which the creation of Maradona as an idol is being built. I remember a remote example, but it's typical. It comes back among historians, mostly those working about Argentina, when the opposition to Perón, to the rise of Perón, were alarmed by the fascist connotations of his movement and the fascistic legacies and background of Perón. And they ended their political campaign against the rise of Perón with a big banner that said yes to democracy, no to fascism. And they when Perón actually won, they concluded that people were actually fascist. And it took, depending on how intelligent people were, between 5 days and 50 years to realize that that was not the question. And it wasn't that Perón was not a fascist. It probably was in so many fundamental ways, but that was not what was at stake in people deciding why they were going to support him at a given time in a specific historical moment. I bring this sort of extreme example from something different to see how we locate Maradona in his historical time, and not only as an individual, but mostly as an icon. The way people build those relations, I think, are less transparent in the terms of a Q&A of what he did and did not do, and more, and that's something that I was trying to say during my talk, more related to an emotional level. And by emotional level, I'm not underestimating it. On the contrary, I think it should help us to frame the rational in a different way.
Thanks, Ernesto. There are so many questions, so I'm just picking the more representative. Elsey has a specific question for Matthew. You mentioned the impact of reading Formal Empire and its consequences for stereotypes of Latin Americans in the UK. Given the amount of great Latin American players that transfer to Europe clubs at the elite professional level and the dominance of European organization in global football culture today, do you think there is a link to be made between Formal Empire and the current structure of global football? And how might Maradona in his time as a player be or not to be emblematic at it of this?
Yeah, I can answer that. Thanks, Howard. It's a great question, but I'm reluctant to answer it with Rory Miller in the audience because I know he would do a much better answer than I would. But I'll just say very briefly, I don't. It's not as simple because, of course, FIFA in its early days is many Latin American representatives in FIFA are very important in shaping the direction of FIFA. It's not a British plaything, far from it. And then, of course, you have this transition at the end of the 60s going into the 70s from the Stanley Rouse era into the João Havelange era. So the center of gravity of FIFA is we should give much more weight to South America than Britain in these kind of international things. But I won't do a long answer because I think there's so many great questions and so many great people here to hear.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew. I have a question for myself also. Could you, the three of you, compare Maradona narrative with other football player narrative, for example, on different uses it has been done of narratives? I'm thinking, for example, in Tevez. I know that he has now a TV show in Netflix, and his narrative is also related to poor worker class person that has signed for football, but the effects of the narrative are totally opposite. In fact, he was used by the right administration as part of his campaign, Mauricio Macri as example, or what we can do if we compare Maradona with Pelé as a global icon. If you could choose one character and think where all the similarities are or not. I'm sure there are not similarities at all, but
I can be very, very brief and pick up one that I think the only one that comes to my mind as something similar is Muhammad Ali. In the sense, in this specific sense of the three things that I mentioned at the beginning, which is sort of facing something that was able to that he was able to solve in creative ways that were not done before in the same way, and in the sense that he brought back to the center his racial and social origins, and turned that into a way to describe what he has achieved in the sport, and I would say also in the sense that he was extremely intelligent and funny, the way Maradona actually was. I do think that unlike Maradona, Muhammad Ali was much more directly politically. Less in the emotional way in which I was trying to describe, and or in addition to that, more specifically committed with some specific causes. I think that might have to do with being two different human beings, but also I think the timing, Argentina in the 80s with this narrative arc that I just described before, and the US in the 60s are very different fields, right?
I sort of prefer to see him in contrast to Pelé, and more interested, less in comparing them as players, right? Though obviously Pelé passed a bit more, but I think classic tens and this amazing legacy. But look what has been done by journalists and by historians, and much love for David Goldblatt, but I'm going to depart from his work very sharply right now, to say that Pelé is a consummate professional. Maradona is the leftist, radical, out there rebelling against everything. But Pelé, he is just a sort of pushover for whatever political waves might come. He's very professional. He's not the joy of the people like Garrincha. Now, if you go and read the press from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, that's just absolutely not true. That's not what Pelé was like. He was very much considered to be that the best and player and athlete in the world was Black, and touring decolonial Africa at that moment was incredibly important to the left. And yet it's been completely changed because of the later versions, and because, as he gets older, he, yes, takes a photograph with Bolsonaro's jersey and whatever. But that's not how people in football culture saw him. So I actually think there is a really interesting comparison to be made there, and also a kind of struggle over the narrative that we're still in right now as people that write as critical scholars on Latin Americanists on football. Like, there's a real struggle over those questions, and I think a lot of these narratives we get in the 1980s and 90s, and we inherit from people like Galeano. And, much love to him as a writer. This is not a person that was reviewing, social history type methods.
Matthew, do you want to address the question? Okay.
I mean, Patricia, while you're looking for another question, I'll just say, while we're talking about narratives of footballers, for those of you who don't know, the amazing Wycombe Wanderers footballer called Dave Carroll in the late 1980s, early 1990s, who was known as Jesus because not only did he act like him, he looked like him too, and was greeted with the cry, which I don't think ever happened to Diego Maradona, of Jesus, Jesus, every time he came onto the pitch. Sadly forgotten by the historiography.
Okay. There's a lot of questions about replacing Maradona as a national icon of Argentina. So the one question is, I will bring them together. One question is, what happened with Maradona in this context of the Grieta, as it's called, this division between supposedly Peronist, anti-Peronist. Ernesto, we said Peronist, anti-Peronist, but it could be populist, anti-populist. But also we'll add what happened with Maradona and the context of Malvinas war. If we bring it to a global scope, in particular in the UK, so to make it wider to all the panel to talk about it. So Ernesto, want to start with the populist thing?
Yeah, why not? No, well, but I don't. I think it might be a professional deviation, but I think there's chronology is important, and la grieta, regardless everything people can think about how superfluous that is, relates in part to the creation, probably for the first time in modern history in Argentina, of a right-wing political coalition that is active in Argentine democracy, right? And that is solid, that is quite extended, and that is ideologically very cohesive, at least around the thing that they don't want. And socially also, there's a clivaje social very specific of those who actually think that Argentina is a country that has to become competitive internationally, and knowing that that might not be enough to create an inclusive society and everybody else will have to wait. And those who don't wait are some sort of an obstacle towards that path of modernity. So that started to take shape as a coalition, as a movement around 2006, 7, 8, 9. By that time, Maradona, the icon itself, was already built, and probably based on an extended social base that included some of these people. So probably there is an overlap in there that could not have been possible had Maradona started to play today. And I think that crack shows during the weeks after he passed away, when you see people complaining about the way the country behaves around whether his body had to be or not at the Casa Rosada, or whether people were violent or not around him, and whether in the end people should have as an icon someone so problematic instead of having someone more organized with his life, and otherwise the case of Messi. So I don't know if I answer directly the question. I think that most likely his influence and his presence goes beyond the Grieta, but I think that also the Grieta expresses the historical limits of how that creation belongs to one specific moment. I could not have been reproduced later in life after the beginning of the 21st century, right?
Okay, so Brenda or Matthew, do you want to address something of this topic?
I'm pretty impressed with Ernesto's answer.
Yeah.
Can I answer one question from Alejandro Velasco that now is
Please.
in the chat as a thing that was way back there?
Oh, sure. Sorry, there are too many questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Because now I see. So the question about lionizing.
Okay, yeah,
That?
that's thanks all. A question for Brenda and Matthew, but more generally about lionized figures. In the context of rephrasals of historical figures and their complicated legacies, it seemed almost right to state that Maradona was a complex figure. And yet, some figures do seem to be given a pass, as Brenda mentioned, and others less so. I'm curious, what do you think are the larger dynamics that account for that difference? Okay.
So I just wanted to say a couple things, and maybe you too. I think that it was great that Ernesto started by describing him as an artist, because it's going to make this point a lot easier, which is I think it has to also do with the division of body, mind, athletes, artists that is false and has its own politics. So the idea that footballers might not be expected to have really nuanced politics because they're just not quite as intelligent as a Picasso. And I think at least in the academy that I don't think in larger, in journalistic circles that's always true, but at least in academic field, I think that's still the way that it's treated. And I'm not saying that football is, or that sports are the same as every other art, but certainly there's no reason that you couldn't think of it in the same venue as you do dance or lots of other things that are seen as sort of higher culture or more complex. So I actually think that ongoing prejudice and it's still at play when you're talking about why do athletes often get a pass for their politics. I think it's, there's a little, the expectations are lower than when you're going to have full books on Picasso's politics on A, B, or C. And obviously, because they're working with their body, it may not be as explicit as a writer's politics. So there's that as well. And then I think the timing, so path dependent historian, I guess, the timing's always essential in terms of lionization as well. I think, if Maradona's death had come earlier than Ni Una Menos, many of these concerns would not be raised. And I think if it came later, they might be raised differently. So I just wanted to add those things. I think it's a really good question, to keep in mind. It's really.
Matthew and Ernesto want to add something about it. Yes, to continue, I will add a question to Brenda. Sorry, Brenda. But what do you think that, what we could think about what happened with feminism when they have to deal with these popular icons, this new feminism that is more massive and is all the time crossed by tensions about class and this middle class elite and this popular feminism that is in contact also with these popular icons and create all this paradox. And also I will add what happened with these paradoxical figures of Maradona as an icon, with this uses of sometimes queer aesthetics, this small, tiny speedos in the beach, he kissing other men, all those things that were like paradoxical for the 90s. What do you think about all this? Oh, what happens in the social networks now in the last weeks in Argentina? I don't know.
I think it disrupts any sort of neat narrative in a very good way for people, because the feminist movement didn't traditionally have a really strong relationship to sports until Ni Una Menos. The feminist movement itself wasn't that interested in mobilizing women athletes, and that has really changed over the past 10 years. So I think this conversation that's happening right now that I'm reading in Argentina, and there's a few links in the chat, which are great, to different articles written by Argentine feminists. I think it's brand new that that intersection would provoke such a conversation or such a debate, either among feminists or among, you know, people who are just rabid about sports and don't really think about feminism all that often. I think one of the most troubling things is that their comments have been taken out of context to say, look at how the queer community and look at how women just want to cancel everybody. They just go around canceling. And if you actually read the posts, asking for accountability is not canceling. Like that, so it's used very much by the right. It's used very much by people who are opposed to the feminist movement, and it's exacerbated as that's the only thing they want to talk about when it comes to Maradona, even though frequently that's the only time, you know, women are invited to speak publicly on football. There are plenty of women in Argentina that could talk about a technical comparison between, you know, Riquelme and Maradona, but how many people are going to ask women? So part of that also exaggerates and exacerbates the idea that the feminist movement is obsessed with canceling Maradona in Argentina, which I can tell you is not the case.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. Well, I will continue with the questions. We have 10 minutes left. Paul Stitch says, I wondered a bit about how we locate politics with regard to soccer. In much of the conversation, there seems to be a bit of a sense that politics exists outside of the game. But even if we think about making sense of the relationship of the player to the game, example, in terms of professionalism versus amateur, with its own history, that's one approach to a playing to game. It was one of the comment. The question, sorry, is even political. Sorry, there are too many questions. I'm a little lost. Sorry. If you seek another question, okay. Okay, I think what we can do is a final round of each of you want, if you want to give a final comment or something to close the debate of this Q&A session, to take advantage of this 10 minutes we had. Are you good with that? Or you want to add something to the debate? Ernesto want to, so.
No, I'll be short. I am short, but I'll be short. In relation to the last comment that you read, yes, the sport is and football in particular is inherently political, but not only in the sense that everything is political, but in the sense that the history of football in Latin America goes on the side and in the middle of the history of creation, or the creation of national identities, and the creation of a regional identity, starting with the very fact of this building a distance with the creators of football and in England, and a set of symbols, some of them total inventions, some of them with some real basis in terms of style, in terms of the way we were people play in Latin America, in terms of how people who play feel about that. Which I don't think are necessarily real, and I don't think the way people feel about football in Argentina defines their identity in opposition to what's going on in France or in the UK. But I do think, in relation to that comment, that there's an entry point, and probably is in crisis in the last couple of decades. There's an entry point into sports in general, but football in particular, that breaks or dissolves that division, that huge separation, that grieta between professional and amateur. Not in the sense of how the history of football actually started with the professionals being the lower classes and the amateurs being those privileged who didn't have anything, didn't have any kind of economic need, but in the sense of a later modern sense of considering the amateurs as those who are not necessarily prepared or fully committed or deeply engaged with an industry that is perfectly and rationally working. And football has provided for a very long time an opportunity to sort of dissolve that and see how professionalism has actually helped to build a better use of the amateur engagement with football. I think, and talking about the characters in themselves, that Maradona in that sense, and the 80s in so many ways, are the last moment in which that is possible. I think that people like Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo, regardless what they are, I have no idea what they think about football. I don't think they have a space to even think about the kind of relation between emotions and joy that their profession brings, in the same way that a football player, a famous football player, could have in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where I think is sort of the last moment for that. And in that sense, I think that Maradona, only in that sense, Maradona becomes over time, not necessarily at the moment, a symbol of a time gone. I think that he was never nostalgic. He was never claimed or built a narrative in which he was tied to any kind of past. I think he's a product of this neoliberal transformation in which he's part of product and sort of an outsider of that. But that over time we can see that kind of problematic relation as sort of one of the last times in which that was possible.
Brenda and Matthew, you want to add something?
I'll go, and then Brenda can have the last word. Yeah, I mean, what Ernesto just said there was a great way of summing up. So in a way, I feel silly saying anything. I guess if in the UK we're going to put up a statue to any Argentinian sports person, I would probably prefer, before we do the Diego Maradona one, we do one to Lillian Gemma Harrison, who was the first person to swim across the Rio de la Plata in 1923, and coincidentally a woman, and went to school in Hertfordshire. And I think that the fact that we're considering, we're having this event about Diego is precisely because of what Ernesto said, because he kind of sits at the top of these various layers of nation, masculinity, and class. So he occupies this amazing place at the time of global transformation. But yeah, so I'll just say, it's been a total pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Been a real privilege to be a part of it.
Okay, I don't really want to close this event. It's so sad. It's so fun. We could be here forever, but just to connect with both of what you're saying about what the romanticization and the nostalgia for a moment that offered some possibilities that might seem closed today. I think one of the things that made Maradona so beloved by even women who criticized him, by Barcelona fans, by Napoli fans, is also that he brought a culture that had been built by the civic associations that were clubs in Argentina, and even to the extent that he would bring drummers and hire them himself at Napoli because he felt like the stadium wasn't loud enough Like it was frustrating. Like that's an amazing thing. Like when he arrived at Napoli, there were tons of interviews about his time with Argentinos Juniors, 5 years with them. And we forget about the fact that he was built and created by this culture because you extract the genius. And then it's very easy to forget about that. And so I would just like to add on, and I guess for me, it's a good way to end, that those clubs are still in struggles against privatization, that's really important politically. And then if we want to see another figure like Maradona and maybe even get a feminist version of one, that it's not to reject football or working class football tradition, but support the women that are trying, and the queer community that is trying to make the stadiums a newly dynamic place. Argentina as a domestic league that can both be vibrant, less corrupt, and that also means less sexist, I think.
Well, thanks everyone for participating in this amusing and fantastic event and discussion about Maradona as a global icon. Thanks Brenda, Matthew, and Nestor for the time. Hope you have a good evening. I'm sorry we couldn't take all the questions, but there were so many questions. So goodbye, everyone. A final clap to the speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. That was really cool. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So many are the people.